Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to our European friends. My name is Natalia Banulescu-Bogdan, and I'm the Assistant Director of MPI's International Program here in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining the Migration Policy Institute for our webinar on Will Britain Leave the EU? The Role of Immigration in Brexit. Before we begin, I have just a couple of technical announcements. First, the audio from this event will be available later today on MPI's website, migrationpolicy.org. While you're on the call, if you have any technical problems, just email events@migrationpolicy.org or call 202-266-1910. If you have any problems hearing online, just dial in using the call-in information sent to you via email. Finally, we're going to have a question and answer session at the end of the call. To participate, please type any questions into the Q&A or chat box on the right side of your screen, or you can email questions to events@migrationpolicy.org. You can also tweet your question to @migrationpolicy or #MPIDiscuss. And before we dive in, we would also like to point you to some related work on MPI's website. If you haven't seen it already, we have a source article on Brexit, the role of migration in the upcoming EU referendum, written by Will Somerville, our first panelist. We also have a new series from MPI's Transatlantic Council on Migration, on building and maintaining trust in the governance of migration, which explores what is driving some of the anxiety about immigration we are seeing today and how policymakers can address it. So our topic for today is Brexit, which of course refers to the decision that UK citizens will make on June 23rd on whether or not to remain in the European Union. This is not the first controversial EU referendum, but it is the first time that a major EU member state has put full membership to a popular vote. Polls suggest that a backlash against immigration is one of the major drivers behind the desire to leave the EU, which begs the question of whether Britain leaving the EU would actually reduce the kinds of migration that the public is most anxious about, and if so, at what cost? This also brings up a host of questions of the potential spillover effects that might affect the functioning of the European Union as a whole. At a time when the EU has only expanded, would a major exit deal a mortal blow to the European project itself and spark debates over EU membership in other countries? To shed some light on these questions, we have two excellent panelists here with us today. So first, I want to extend a warm welcome to my colleague, Will Somerville, who has been part of our European team here at MPI for the past decade. He is a UK Senior Fellow at MPI and also the Program Director for Unbound Philanthropy in London. Prior to joining MPI, Will worked at the Commission for Racial Equality, the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit's Cabinet Office, and the Institute for Public Policy Research in the UK. He is an astute analyst of UK immigration and the ebbs and flows of public opinion, and you can find his latest policy brief on these topics, Engaging the Anxious Middle on Immigration Reform, Evidence from the UK Debate, on the MPI website, along with his article on Brexit. So Will, what can you tell us about what's driving the referendum and what we can expect?
Thanks, Natalia, and morning, afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to talk to that question in three parts. The first part is how we got here, and how we, I mean the UK. Secondly, the state of the race, where campaigning, polling, and the dynamics of that race is. And lastly, the consequences of the vote for the UK, for both politics, policy, and the patterns and shape of migration in the future. So firstly, how did we get here? Well, the first factor has absolutely nothing to do with migration, and it's about the dynamics of internal party policy, specifically the Conservative Party, one of the UK's two main parties on the centre, the Conservative Party on the centre-right. And within that party, Europe has always been a key fault line ever since the 1992 Maastricht Treaty. And that party really now divides between those who are hard Eurosceptics and those who are soft Eurosceptics. And understanding that dynamic makes many of the micro decisions far more comprehensible. The second factor, however, has a lot to do with migration, and that's the rise of the UK Independence Party, or UKIP. UKIP was established as a political party in 1993, but it only really broke through as a major political force in 2013 in the local elections in the UK. Then it won the European elections in the UK, and most recently in 2015 at the general election, it garnered 4 million votes, although very few seats, just a single seat, in fact, in the UK Parliament. And the key to UKIP's rise is migration, and for UKIP voters there is a significant degree of hostility to migration. They are migration rejectionists on the whole, and this is pretty clear from polling evidence. So if you ask UKIP voters what's the #1 issue that's facing the country, 70% will say migration. If you compare that to other voters for other parties, it's a far lower figure. Conservatives, 45% say migration is important. For the Labour Party, 25% say it's important. And essentially this means that politics has essentially caught up with public attitudes over the last decade. If you go back a decade, you find that those who want to reject migration or are hostile to migration, those were largely driven by newspaper readership. If you asked Daily Mail or Daily Express readers, that was the biggest single correlate. Now, the biggest single correlate to holding an anti-migration view is to be a supporter of UKIP. So UKIP essentially surged as a political force, and that meant that all other parties reacted. And now most of British politics takes a sceptical view of migration and work off a platform of lowering migration numbers and seeking to restrict entitlements of migrants. UKIP has always pushed for a referendum on the EU, and it was this combination of dynamics between the Conservative Party internally and the rise of UKIP that really led us to where we are today. But underneath all that, there is a very important point, which is that this referendum is in part a referendum on sovereignty and the pace of change. So immigration to the UK has changed dramatically over the last 20 years. The foreign-born population, for example, has doubled to 8.3 million people. That's 13%. And part of that, and I'll go on later to talk about the numbers, part of that is very much about immigration from the European Union. So with a bloc which has 508 million citizens who have free movement across member states, including the UK, this vote is really a vote about how far the UK public will countenance the European Union shaping a response to that phenomenon. So moving on to the second question around the state of the race. The question is whether to remain in the European Union or to leave the European Union. And as of today, there is a small lead for remaining in the European Union. So current polling, which is an aggregate of 33 polls from 8 firms, and I've taken the polls from the beginning of April, it's 47% favour leaving, 47% favour remaining, 40% favour leaving, and 12% are undecided. So that's 47 remain, 40 leave. So a small but durable lead. And the betting markets are currently predicting that the UK will remain. To sum that up, we have about a 1 in 4 chance of leaving the European Union. Now, the public have quite different views on leaving and remaining, and the coalitions behind those two sides are quite different. So UKIP and Conservative members favour leaving, older people favour leaving, and those in England are more divided than those in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. But at the heart of this race, it will be decided by 2 factors. The first is turnout, and the second is how conservative-leaning voters will actually vote. So, and briefly, higher turnout favours remaining in Europe, and conservative swing voters who lean towards leaving that how they vote will be key. So, turning to migration in the state of the race, it's very clear that migration correlates concerns over migration correlates very highly with wanting to leave the European Union. UKIP voters, and about a quarter of the UK population who are the most hostile to migration, are the most strongly correlated to leaving. So really this race depends on that middle, that anxious middle, how they decide to vote. And their number one concern relating to their vote on Europe is the state of the economy. That's the number one. But closely behind it are two other issues, sovereignty and migration. And it's really, you can see how the campaigns are trying to take advantage of that. And I think the key point in terms of migration here is that to move to the 50% threshold to win the referendum, for those favouring leave or Brexit, will really depend on whether they can persuade those who are already sceptical that there won't be economic damage to leaving. That's at the right of the heart of this referendum. So to move on to the consequences of leaving or remaining, for Brexit or Remain, I'm going to divide up a few comments here into the politics of it, the policy and the patterns. So the politics, and let's start with Remain. If there is a vote to remain in Europe, there's an instinctive feel that status quo will continue, but actually that's pretty unlikely. The vote will depend hugely on whether it's a very close result or whether it's an emphatic result. If it's an emphatic result, then the Prime Minister David Cameron and the Chancellor George Osborne will be strengthened. They'll have more capital, more political capital, to work on issues around migration, both in the UK and in Europe. And of course, this doesn't mean that there's going to be a huge sudden change in attitudes, but there will potentially be an evolution of migration policy in the UK. For example, the net migration target, which has been at the centre of UK policy for the last 6 or 7 years, is likely to evolve. It's possible with an emphatic result that there'll be more engagement of the UK government in the refugee crisis. The patterns of migration are at a headline level unlikely to change hugely, but there will be changes. The Cameron renegotiation in the European Union that was part of the campaign will lead to some changes, particularly increases in migrant poverty in the UK. And over time, we can expect the flows into the UK to become more highly skilled. And it might be worth me just giving a reminder of numbers here. So in 2014, there were 632,000 immigrants into the United Kingdom. Around half of that figure are immigrants from the European Union. And across the board, across all 630,000, around 3/4 come for work or study. Less than a tenth come for family, and less than a 20th come for to claim asylum. So the flows into the United Kingdom are broadly and predominantly work and study, and that's even more true of those coming from Europe. So if there's a Remain vote, we can expect some quite large changes as the policy around migration evolves. And the degree of how far it evolves will be a lot down to the size of the win, as it were, for Remain. So turning to Leave or Brexit, of course all bets are off. This would be among the biggest and most substantial changes that the UK has undertaken. In terms of politics, there would be some dramatic shifts very quickly. The Prime Minister David Cameron would almost certainly resign immediately, although he may spend some time in terms of orchestrating his departure. There would be very likely to be a referendum on the future of Scotland. Scotland is, of course, a member of is 4 countries of the United Kingdom, and there'd be a good chance that they would become independent. And there would almost certainly be at least short-term economic hits, a large drop in the pound, some serious economic damage, at least in the short term. What would happen to policy, migration policy? Well, of course, again, we don't know. But the most likely would be an extension of the existing migration system to cover the European Union. So lots of talk of keeping free movement and maintaining this current system of free movement is pie in the sky within UK politics. If there's a Brexit vote, the reason will be hostility to migration, and the answer has to be restrictions on migration. What those look like are hard to say, but the key points will be that there'll be restrictions on European migrants, probably, as I said, an extension of the points-based system. That will mean fewer Eastern Europeans, fewer younger workers, and a far lower number of people entering with lower qualifications and income levels. That will certainly hit certain businesses, agriculture, hospitality, retail, and it will also hit certain public services like elder care, for example. And what will it mean for patterns if we leave, the patterns of migration? Well, again, of course, I want to emphasize that this is hypothetical and we don't know. It is almost certain that lower migration would happen with restrictions on European migrants. But it's likely that the composition of those immigrant flows will also change quite significantly. In particular, there'll be far fewer Eastern Europeans who tend to have less income and qualification levels. So we're likely to see a lower immigration at a slightly more skills level. However, it's unlikely to change as much as everyone hopes. So our expectation is that you would still see immigration, which is currently a net immigration of currently around 300,000, would drop to no more than 200,000. We would also see huge spikes immediately after. Experience of migration patterns shows that very clearly. You would have major concerns over the existing residents in the UK and their legal entitlements to stay for them and their families. And undoubtedly, you would have an increase in unauthorized or illegal immigration. So I think they're the major projections forward for the Remain and the Leave side. And I'll leave it there. Thank you, Natalia.
Thank you, Will, for those excellent framing remarks. Just a reminder to our audience that you can submit questions to our panelists at any time using the Q&A function on your screen or by emailing events@migrationpolicy.org. And if you need any technical assistance, just call 202-266-1929. So, Will, you've brought up several of the intersecting concerns that are driving this referendum. Economic concerns, who benefits and who loses out from immigration, the rapid pace of change, and this desire, an elusive desire perhaps, for better control over immigration, and of course, some skepticism of the EU's role in all of this. So this segues very nicely into our next presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce our second panelist, Demetrios Papademetriou, who will place this debate into a broader European context for us and also speak to these themes of the erosion of public trust, government's ability to manage migration. Demetrios is, of course, the founder and president emeritus of MPI and currently president of MPI Europe in Brussels. He is the convener of both the Transatlantic Council on Migration and MPI's Regional Migration Study Group and has published hundreds of reports and articles on all aspects of migration policy. He has contributed several papers to our recent series on public trust and migration, including a comprehensive report on how to maintain trust in the governance of migration, as well as a piece on managing religious difference in North America and Europe, and more are forthcoming. So, Demetri, to what extent is what we're seeing in the United Kingdom indicative of a broader trend throughout Europe?
First of all, thank you, Natalia. This is a great question to start with, and thank you, Will. It's a rare pleasure to actually be on the same panel as you are. And apologies to my colleagues and friends around this webinar. I am in Brussels, breathing the air of Brussels, which is an unhealthy air more generally. I would say, I would probably make comments in 5 different areas. The first area is I want to place the conversation, the British conversation, as it were, in the context of these quintessential political campaigns that are almost uniquely Anglo-Saxon. In other words, if this was about Germany trying to leave the EU or about most other places, you could never have the claims and counterclaims that have been put on the table with the intensity and the numbers that they have been put on the table over the past many months, let alone a year or 2 that you're having in the UK. And I must say that we're going to get many more of them, with everyone basically saying something at least extraordinary. The second thing that I will say a few things about is what is the EU thinking about all this conversation? I will call that a brief commentary, the fear of the great unraveling, because indeed the EU, as have most of us, most countries, are deeply in a new age of deep uncertainty. I will then talk a little bit about, how vulnerable really is the EU on the issues that matter to us, all the migration-related issues, but also issues that are adjacent in policy terms to migration, and then lead into the question of the fact that Brussels is having a hard time maintaining the confidence or the trust of the member states. We know that there's always been a gap in trust between the people of Europe, as it were, broadly speaking, and Brussels itself. But this is about an enormous gap that has developed between Brussels, which on this issue is simply a misnomer, because this is essentially a Germany-led issue, and an awful lot of the other member states of the EU. And finally, I will say a couple of words about the kinds of things that newspapers write about, not about Brexit, about Brussels and about the EU, that somehow the EU is in terminal decline. And I will say a couple of points about that. So the conversation will start where Natalia asked the question, is this something that only is happening in the UK? And the answer is, it's not. We're having, as most people around this webinar who listen in, have their own experiences. They're mostly in the States, and God only knows we're having severe difficulties with the topic of migration in our electoral cycle. I think that maybe the U.S. electoral cycle is a good analog to this, Brexit debate and to the decision of the British public on the 23rd of June. What has, and here is where the similarities are, is that now almost everyone has spoken in favor of the one or the other issue, and certain things which in the United States we would find completely unacceptable have also entered the conversation about Brexit. For instance, President Obama entering this debate with, I think, a rather uncomfortable and awkward way of saying that, the people ought to resist or oppose Brexit, and then going the further mile or 2 or 100 miles to basically say that the United States will have a very hard time negotiating, new agreements with the UK, which is really palpably not likely to happen. So we have moved from, let's say in the past year, from slight exaggerations, which are, pretty much par for the course on an issue that is as political, as difficult as this, to systematic hyperbole, which almost, you can say, can be expected, to now, in the last month or so, and for the remaining time between now and June 23rd, to almost apocalyptic kinds of statements, extraordinary claims that the sky somehow will fall, and the using of proxies such as President Obama to actually make the case for staying in clearly at the request of the British government. And something else has happened in the process. We have actually now come in Europe to the same point where we have come in the United States. That is, economists, 100 of them, 200 of them, or 20 of them, arguing that the sky will fall if Britain, the UK, exits. And then another group of economists or academics making the opposite argument. So we're now at the point where the pro and con positions are totally predictable, but it is also always interesting to see what is the new wrinkle that the latest group of high priests will say about the possibility of exit, of Brexit. I think there is a lesson here, and I'll move to the next one, that basically says, to me at least, that whatever patience we had and respect we have had with high priests, be they law professors or economists or political science professors or any other group of people, has now, in a sense, has been exhausted, and the high priests now are being treated the way I think that high priests ought to be treated, which is another interest group that is making a political point and finds data and arguments to support it. The second item that I'm going to say a few things is this great unraveling. Indeed, the EU is now deeply in a new age of uncertainty. And yet there is a palpable sense, almost every few days, that the centrifugal forces that are contributing to that sense of uncertainty are being fueled by another whatever event or the realization that the European institutions and their pronouncements don't really matter that much, that the promises that come out of Europe are so often empty promises. And this is really something that people are focusing on. I call it the gap between promise and performance, which of course means that there is ever greater skepticism about the value or the ability of the European institutions to actually address difficult issues. Now, to be completely fair here, the European institutions, the central institutions, by that I mean the Brussels institutions, the Commission, the Council, and of course the Parliament, were not really designed to deal with such very difficult political and cultural, social issues, like an issue of what it is that they should be doing about the matters of migration and the crisis that has befallen Europe in the last year or so. So whether the way that something else that is fueling this division is that an awful lot of the European governments, key governments, are being shaped. The positions of these governments are being shaped by groups that are really commanded by skeptics, in some instances by extremists, in many instances by pessimists. And regardless of whether they're part of the government, as happens in a couple of places, or simply not part of the government, but simply shaping the government agenda because they control a large number of votes, this is really something that we see in far too many places, from France, Italy, Spain, Denmark, etc., etc. And in addition to that, we now have a group of Eastern Europeans the so-called Visegrad Four, that are really working on this issue in opposition to their brothers and sisters in the EU, and certainly in opposition to Brussels, to the Commission, and they are voting as a bloc, and they are refusing to cooperate. And that, again, contributes to the sense that there is something that is chipping away at what Europe took 40 or however many. If you go back to 1951, the European and Coal and Steel Community, that's whatever, 70 years ago, it's chipping away at what it is that Europe has created. The third point is that, indeed, there is, objectively speaking, a sense of vulnerability, a sense that the EU and, the collection of different groupings of European member states have proven themselves to be not capable of addressing last year's issue, because this year may very well be a slightly different or a massively different issue. So when it comes to border controls, whether it comes to managing migration, whether it comes to having successful integration outcomes and societies that are cohesive, where it comes to terrorism, or for that matter, when it comes to relations with the neighborhood, countries in the neighborhood, in all of those, when you look at what it is that has been accomplished, you realize that this is not a terrific record for the EU and member states, with few exceptions that are notable, including Germany. That it is really a very difficult thing to give anything more than a passing grade, what I think we call in the United States a gentleman's C, or even less than that. But even when it comes to policy areas that are adjacent to migration, the issue of trade, the issue of budgets more generally, in other words, the fact that everybody focuses on the problems that Greece is having with its budgets. But in reality, most EU member states, and in truth, many other countries around the world, have entered and are really controlled under what one may call a debt trap. And an awful lot of investors, I don't know if they're smart investors or dumb investors, but investors more generally have essentially been abandoning Europe because they're selling off their assets. And the Commission and the European institutions in all of those things are trying to find the right equilibrium point on all of these difficult issues that will allow them to maintain some of the confidence and trust that the member states require if they are to come up with solutions that somehow can take care of today's problem and set the stage for having a better tomorrow than the one that we have had yesterday. So what we have and we need most, what we have is lack of trust, an increasing lack of trust. What we need most is to begin to rebuild that trust that will allow the EU to function in a way that is effective enough. This way it can build political capital that will help it move on to the next stage. The final point, there's an awful lot of talk, at least in newspapers, but also in conversations among the cognoscenti, whatever that is, in Brussels and other European capitals as to whether the EU is in terminal decline. I find these conversations completely overdrawn. I find them to be mostly a reflection of this very sort of messy situation in which the issue of migration and all the related issues has created, the messiness it has created throughout parts of Europe. But ultimately, my judgment on this is that this idea of terminal decline and all of these other phrases, are completely overdrawn and exaggerated. The answer to this question, at least my answer, is that whether the EU is in terminal decline, the answer is not any more or less than the United States or any other rich country is in decline. You can ask the same question about Germany or Japan or France or the UK itself. And I'll stop here. Thank you, Natalia.
Thank you so much, Dimitri, for those always informative and always provocative remarks. I'm going to now open the floor to questions from the audience. So once again, please use the Q&A function on your screen or email events@migrationpolicy.org, or you can tweet @migrationpolicy or hashtag MPIDiscuss. We've received a few interesting questions already about the effect of the referendum on the UK economy. So I'm going to break some of these questions into two parts, one for Will and one for Dimitri. So first for Will, we have some questions about the large migration the large migration flows from Poland to the UK in the past, how this has played into the conversation about Brexit, and how restrictions on Eastern European workers are likely to influence economic competitiveness in the future. And then for Dimitri, we have a question about, again, about the effects of immigration on the economy. Many analysts point to the fact that we don't have much evidence that immigrants to the UK push wages down or increase unemployment. In fact, most agree that immigration is a net positive to the economy. So why do we see such strong reactions to it? So first turning to Will to talk about the intra-EU flows.
Thanks, Natalia. So I think it might just be worth putting in some contextual points for those listening about European migration. So at the present time, those born in Europe living in the UK, so that's the foreign-born from Europe in the UK, number about 3 million people. Of that 3 million European-born population, around 1.7 million are from Eastern Europe. And of that 1.7 million, a good 2/3 are Polish. So that translates into the fact that the Polish population of the UK is the largest foreign-born population, and that is an extraordinary change over the last decade and a bit. So since 2004, when the UK opened up to Poland, they've moved from a foreign-born community that was, from memory, the 13th or 14th largest to the largest foreign-born population. So a very, very big, a large-scale migration. That group of Polish and other Eastern European communities have, of course, been largely very successful in the UK. The vast majority come for work or study, so around 85% come for work or study. They have extremely high employment rates, and as a consequence, most of the economic analyses of Eastern Europeans and Polish in particular point to a significant fiscal gains to the United Kingdom. There have broadly been studies around how the Polish community have integrated have also largely been positive. So it's been successful, but of course the scale of it, particularly because many Polish communities didn't go to London, which is the traditional destination of immigrants, and actually moved all around the UK. The scale and the spread showed a pretty fast pace of change in many, many communities across the UK, and this was reasonably unsettling for many communities. And so while you see the British public being broadly in favour of the integration potential of Polish communities and aware of their benefit in terms of fiscal benefit, there's also been concerns around the pace of change. And I think this has not featured heavily in the EU referendum or Brexit debate, partly because this is a general election mandate, so Polish people cannot vote in this referendum. So the electorate is 45 million people in the UK, and foreign-born non-citizens in Europe cannot vote, although Commonwealth citizens resident in the UK can. So they've not featured heavily in Brexit debates thus far, but the broad narrative is around a immigrant community that's large, that's led to changes, and while of economic and benefit and has contributed to, has not led to any cohesion issues, it's also true that people have been concerned about that scale and the pace of change that has emerged from it.
Thank you so much. Dimitri, do you want to add a little bit to this intersection between economic concerns and anxiety about immigration?
Right, and thank you again, Natalia. I think Will has done a terrific job in identifying many of the reasons, and also a good job, in terms of what it is that the literature tells us, that indeed when it comes to issues of unemployment, wage deterioration, etc., the overwhelming majority, in fact, of all the studies are indicating that the effects are very small, and in terms of the larger kinds of issues, economics, etc., they're largely positive and sometimes very positive. So, of course, this begs the question of why there is still this reaction, and of course, Will has already indicated one of the important ones. The rate of change is a very important one. This is about people literally seeing change, literally, and I mean that, in front of their eyes. In other words, communities that change in a matter of very short periods of time by the standard of how community change can actually be acceptable versus change that increases anxiety. But there are also all of these cultural issues that are associated with change, whether it's language, whether it is the willingness, again, from the perspective of the existing population, the willingness of people to adapt the customs, the habits, the ethos of the countries, or of the communities in which they have settled. All of those things, create this sense of uneasiness that then is furthered, or is reinforced by the composition of the newcomers. Everyone is talking about how large a proportion of the Poles, for instance, Polish workers, constitute of the overall total, and indeed in many communities in which they have become a dominant force, they contribute to that sense of uneasiness. But issues of social and religious and ethnic distance, in other words, the composition of newcomers in a particular, a specific place in the UK, also contribute to this. Finally, there are two other things that are a little more difficult, but nonetheless, we also need to acknowledge. All of these processes, be they immigration or openings to trade or greater openness more generally, have also people who, let's call them losers, people who lose out of the process, people who have something in front of them that tells them, whether it's true or not, that tells them that no one cares about what has happened to their lives. And, this is something, of course, that in our case in the United States, Mr. Trump has exploited so dramatically. And in the case of the UK, I suspect this is something that the literature, particularly the economics literature, really does not want to acknowledge and do something about. Ultimately, it seems to me that in order for these issues, for the toxicity of those issues, to actually be lessened and for us to be able to develop the proper antidotes to that, we have to not only acknowledge that they are losers, but do something about them. In other words, throw training at them, opportunities for them to move completely, from one part of the economy to another, subsidies in order for them to continue to, in a sense, have access and be able to stay in their homes, etc., etc. Nobody can do much about technological change, but the sense among many of these people that somebody can do something both about trade and immigration. And finally, of course, there are all sorts of idiosyncratic factors. London is not the UK, and the UK is not London. So the issues in London are going to be different than the issues in some of the, let's say, the older places that have lost all the industry that they used to have. And parts of the UK, in certain, the southern part, is not the same thing as some of the northern part, and how each of those two parts of the country may be experiencing the kind of change that immigration has brought about.
Thank you, Dimitri. And it's a good reminder that while sometimes we talk about the overall economic benefits of migration, those tend to accrue at the national level, while, of course, costs are felt very acutely at the local level. We have a couple more questions now that I'd like to get to on the mechanics of an exit and what that would mean for both the UK's competitiveness and ability to attract immigrants, as well as what that would mean for security and borders. Before I pass those along, just another reminder that you can submit questions using the chat function on the right of the screen, or you can send an email to events@migrationpolicy.org or tweet at migrationpolicy or hashtag MPI discuss. So, Will, maybe you'd like to just start off by talking about the UK's ability to attract high-skilled migrants in the event of an exit, and what the implications would be for things like the recognition of foreign qualifications or the selection process itself.
Yes, I mean, we don't know what policy would be put in place under any Brexit scenario, but I think it's worth remembering that if there was Brexit, that 1 in 4 chance or so of Brexit, it would be a vote driven by immigration. Essentially, the present moment is one where there is a substantial minority of people who are driven at all costs around migration to vote to leave, and there is a majority of people who favour restrictions on migration, but that calculus that they're making changes when you bring in the economic risks of doing so. So voters are essentially, they want the ends of restricted migration, but they don't necessarily, or at least a majority currently, don't necessarily want the means of doing so, which is economic damage. Now, turning to the question of high-skilled, it's very clear that there is a durable majority public support for high-skilled migration. So that will remain the case either way, Brexit or whether we remain. And the UK system of attracting high-skilled migrants, which has been broadly successful, works on the basis of the points-based system, which is very much focused on an income threshold, which is predicted actually to rise by April 2017 to what is actually a very high number of £30,000 a year, and very high qualifications alongside that. So that system would be extended broadly, I would say, regardless of Brexit or whether we remain. So the system will move towards an increasingly selective one on high-skilled. Now, whether or not we can attract high-skilled immigrants is an interesting secondary question. And of course, that will depend on the state of the economy, which is the major driver for this. And it's clear that, under nearly any forecast, in the short term, there's likely to be some damage to the UK economy and the period of the negotiation of a new trade deal, which under Article 50 of the Treaty of Lisbon has to be done within a 2-year period, so a very quick period. And given that it would have to have migration restrictions as part of that, it will not be a favourable trade deal under any realistic scenario whatsoever. And that's a key point. If it's Brexit, there'll be migration restrictions, there will be a poor trade deal with the EU. That, alongside the uncertainty, is bound to have some shocks to the UK economy. But it's clear that London will remain a major centre. The UK economy is still a very large global economy, 5th largest economy. Jobs will continue to exist that will attract high-skilled immigrants. So I anticipate that the way the system will go either way will be higher income thresholds, higher qualifications, and while demand will almost certainly reduce in the short term with under a Brexit scenario with lots of damage and less trade deals, I do think that there'll be sufficient demand on an ongoing basis for the sort of numbers that are coming in.
Thank you so much, Will. I think we'll use the time we have left to turn to our security and borders questions, and I'm going to throw one to each of you. So first, for Dimitri, can you tell us a little bit about the security impact of a European Union without the United Kingdom? And then I'm going to turn to Will to talk about the impact on borders and security of a United Kingdom without the European Union. So Dimitri, you first.
Thank you, Natalia. I think the impact on security is going to be minimal. First of all, the UK is exercising border controls and has security protocols that are probably as effective, if we can judge by the fact that we haven't had anything, any terrorist attacks since 2004. That the security protocols that the UK exercises are indeed quite strong. Now, this, as they say about Wall Street, past success does not always guarantee future success, but I suspect that the UK allows its security protocols to evolve, and it probably has some concerns that are similar to the concerns that the United States has, or we have, about people from the rest of the EU that have now absolute right to travel to Europe, although border controls will still be exercised, are being exercised today and will be exercised even more so in the future. There are certain types of profiles, that the UK will continue to be particularly mindful of. So, if anything, I imagine that the EU will now feel, let's say, post-Brexit, if there is, that I find the outcome of Brexit also unlikely, pretty much on the same grounds that Will has put on the table. But I suspect that regardless of what happens, the UK has been very careful about those who travel to the UK for whatever reasons. I want to say one more thing about this high skill stuff. I totally agree with Will that the UK will continue to be very attractive for among highly skilled, because it will have great opportunities for them. I think that initially, at least until things get sort of sorted out, the places in which you're going to find a bit if not chaos, but certainly a bit of uncertainty, is at the middle skills, which is what a lot of the people from Poland and elsewhere are providing for the UK, but even more so at the lower paid service jobs. You notice I did not say the low skilled, because many of these people, many of those kids that do all of the restaurant work, et cetera, in London and elsewhere, indeed, are quite well educated. So I think that there's going to be a messy period for a year or less, during which these kinds of jobs, will have to sort of be rethought, and during a period that the UK will have to come up with smart, streamlined ways for continuing to have access to some of those people in a way that's not going to be all that dramatically different than what it is that is happening today.
Thank you, Dimitri. And just a quick follow-up on your previous comments on the security side. Can you just say 1 minute on what you think might be the effect on the future of NATO and transatlantic relations to broaden out internationally a bit?
Right. I mean, I imagine that there will be absolutely nothing that will change with regard to NATO. NATO is an alliance that has, not only survived, but, survived relatively well, 40 or 50 or 60 years, whatever the math is, since the beginning of NATO. The UK has been a stalwart, has been a key member of NATO. I suspect one of the things that the UK will have to do if it were to again exit, a big if, it will have to probably reinvest in its own military forces and technology, et cetera, because now it will have to carry its own weight, not just its weight together with the weight of the rest of the Europeans. Now, considering that most of the Europeans do not even come close to invest in what they have promised, again and again, that will invest in their military, the role of the UK will become even more important as an independent actor. The second part of the question, Natalia, was what?
Was about transatlantic relations.
Transatlantic. This is one of the most overblown things, and I think that, unfortunately, our president has contributed to that sense that somehow the UK will go in the back of the line in terms of sort of figuring out and sorting out the relationship with the United States. However you slice it, the relationship between the United States and the UK is the strongest relationship, the deepest relationship, the relationship that goes, sort of is longer and deeper than any other relationship. I suspect that once the result of June 23rd is known, whichever way the outcome is, the United States, the next president of the United States, even this president, will find it advantageous to the U.S. To actually start developing, rethinking, or coming up with new ways in which the relationship between the United States and of course Canada and the UK will continue. It will probably thrive. There may be a bit of a hiccup, but I think that there are many different ways in which one can take care of the hiccup on a temporary basis. But the idea that somehow the UK will have to go to the end of the line because somehow we're going to invest all of our political capital in order to have the transatlantic trade agreement and all that, these are the kinds of things, that can drive a listener or a reader crazy. And I suspect that we're going to find relatively good, interesting, quick ways to make sure that the special relationship is maintained in the fullest possible way.
Thank you, Dimitri. And you've given a sneak peek already about what investments the UK is likely to have to make, but I'll just turn to Will to give us 2 minutes on that.
I'll probably do less than 2 minutes because I broadly agree with Dimitri's comments, which is surprisingly rare. No, I'm kidding. The effects on security on the Brexit debate, I also think will be minimal. The two major reasons for that are that the UK is not part of the Schengen agreement and has its own border controls. And secondly, that the major security issues roiling the European Union, particularly around Paris attacks, to some extent the issue in Cologne, these issues have not been felt deeply in the United Kingdom, and the second reason is largely, of course, to do with the fact that the major refugee crisis has not manifested itself in the same way in the UK. So, and the empirical data bears this out. Less than a 20th of the inflow is spontaneous asylum claims last year. So that's around 26,000 people have claimed asylum in the last year that data is available for, which in contrast to other countries in the EU is very small. I also think the impacts on the geopolitics of this has been overstated. I would probably be slightly less sanguine than Demetriou around the role of the UK in certain security and international fora, but I broadly agree. I think the one point where it's both obvious, extremely obvious, but worth mentioning, is that many of these issues are event-driven. So, you know, if there's a terrorist attack on UK soil in the next month, all bets are off.
Fair enough. Thank you. I think that's all we have time for today. As a reminder, the audio from the webinar will be on our website later today, migrationpolicy.org, where you will also find related work on Brexit as well as public trust and migration. Keep checking back, as we will be releasing more related reports in the coming weeks. Any reporters on the call can contact Michelle Middlestat at 202-266-1910. Thank you all for joining us today, and a big, big thank you to our two panelists for engaging in this discussion. Thank you.